Good morning. My name is Miss Williams, and we have been studying the transformation of parent graphs with specific emphasis over the standard on y equals x squared, the quadratic function. So we have 5 students that have not been able to take the assessment yet. So those students will be taking a different version of the assessment as soon as possible so that they can have a plan of action to catch up with the other students. We have 10 students that unfortunately have not demonstrated mastery yet on that standard, so they will be invited to work with me in a small group, and we'll go over that plan here in a few moments. We have 35 students that just have a couple areas that they need to provide some extra practice in so that they can show growth and meet that 80% proficiency line. So I have a plan for those students to work on an Edpuzzle video. And I've provided an example for you to see what that would look like. So for example, on the assessment that the students took, if they might have missed a concept, for example, like on completing the square, then they would do something like this, where they were, where they're completing the square. And the video is, in this example, the video is 9 minutes and 44 seconds. So they watch the video, they take some notes, it gets explained to them in a different format, and along the way there's questions that they're being asked and assessed for their understanding of knowledge. And then I can go back and look and see and make sure that they're understanding that concept. And if they're understanding it and they get a better grasp of the knowledge, then they can move on, and that shows me that they've mastered that skill. So this is one way that I can give them a different type of instruction, and while they are doing that independently, then I can be working with the other students. So that's what I'll be doing with the 35 students that almost mastered the topics, but they're just not quite confident enough to move on. And then I have 50 students who have demonstrated proficiency. So they're going to begin with moving towards the next phase of the unit. And we have other parent graphs that we haven't talked about yet, but are very similar to the quadratic in terms of how you graph and approach that. So I'm having them move on to an enrichment activity where they're going to choose 2 different parent graphs. So they can choose between the absolute value graph, the cubic graph, the hyperbola, the square root, or an exponential. And then I have a series of questions that they're going to have to explore, and they're going to have to share their answers out in a chat experience with their peers about what they found. So they're going to have to graph their 2 parent functions. They're going to have to show how they translate those left, right, up, or down. They're going to have to identify the domain range and label different important points, maybe the y-intercept, x and y-intercepts, if there are any, depending on what they come up with for their graph, and the asymptotes. And then they're going to have to write their equations in graphing form and standard form. It's really important that they explore this, because one of the things that I showed the students at the beginning of this unit was our overall project, and I shared with them a rubric that looks like this of what the goal was at the end of this unit. And instead of having an end assessment, a culminating assessment, we're going to have a graphing project that puts all of this together, where they take all of their parent functions and they're graphing a cartoon character. And so I show them this rubric, and then I also show them a sample of what the overall project is going to look like at the end, so that they have an idea of what their goal is. And so they're going to be using all of their parent graphs to come up with a cartoon character. So my enrichment activity is leading those students towards this culminating project, and so they're getting one step closer to that. Now back to my 10 students and what they're going to be doing with me. So the first thing I think is really important is that we spend time going over the test corrections and going over all the test questions. So I've provided you with a sample of the test, and you can see that the test is broken down into 2 components. I think it's really important that the students have an opportunity to focus on a language and communication portion of the test, where they're communicating what their knowledge is and not just computation. And so I provided a sample of what that would look like. So we're going to go through this in detail. And we're going to talk about each question, and I would have the data broken down so that I would know which questions that maybe we could kind of briefly go over if needed at all, and which questions we need to spend more time on. And so we would go through the communication and language problems together. And then we would also go through the operational proficiency problems together. Those are the more computational type problems. And then when we get down to the end, there is one problem solving question, and then that takes a little bit more thought process. And I think that's where I would ask the students to pair up maybe and spend a few minutes going over this together. And I would partner them up and see if they could come up with the answers and see what they had already came up with, and maybe give them an opportunity to collaborate together, because I think that's important that they share their ideas. So after we spend time going over the test, then we would do a Desmos activity. And Desmos is really important in Algebra 2. We spend a lot of time doing graphing activities. And for the students that might not be as comfortable with their graphing calculator, I do feel it's important to teach them those components, as that is something that they will need for their standardized test. But I also feel like it's great to integrate the technology with the Desmos, the online graphing calculator. So with me, we will have an interactive activity on Desmos, which looks like this. Let me see if I can shrink this. So we will first start with these two graphs, where I will show them linear equations, and we'll type these in and we'll talk about why they're linear and the different components with linear equations. And then we will move on to the quadratic, and we'll type these in, and I'll say, okay, what makes that a quadratic? And we'll talk about the different components of that. And then we will add in the shifting of why did that move up 5 units? And then we will add in the next component of what takes that and moves that left and right. And I'll continue giving them examples where they're typing it in so that they get really comfortable with using Desmos. And as this is their final tool to use that they'll have to use for their project. And we'll talk about all of those types of examples and building that out to the final graphing form. And then after we do that, then I will freeze the frame. And then I will give them another one where I get rid of all of these, change this number, and hide this, but show them the graph. For this purpose, I will make it so that it fits this frame. And I will ask them to come up with the equation. So I'm almost doing the reverse of what we were doing before, so that they have all of the tools that they need to be able to go back and forth, because that was one of the main things that we were doing in this unit. Okay, so and then after that, I want to be able to assess the students and see where they're at, and give them a couple of problems where they're trying individually and submitting them to me, so that I can see where they're at, like kind of like an exit ticket type question, and see how they're doing. And if they still need some more practice, then I will go back to where the other 35 students were in terms of the Edpuzzle. And if I need to assign Edpuzzles to any of those 10 remaining students, then I can give them that support as well, so that they have maybe a different level of instruction, and I would assign those accordingly at that point. So that is my plan for remediation in terms of the assessment and enriching the activity for transformations of paragraphs.